Chapter 35 1976 to 1993 Wind Down. Readers will, I hope, agree with me that my life up to 1976 had been full of excitement, travel and adventure. Experiences during my time, both in the Air Force and civilian life, have been wide and varied. In the service, certainly in the R.A.A.F in my day, one followed a cycle of a change of appointment and station about every 2 years. One moved into a new job, worked on getting on top of it, then endeavored to be successful over the whole tour of duty. By the time one got to this stage, it was then time to begin thinking of the next posting and when and where it would be. On leaving the service, most people found it hard to get out of the 2-year cycle, which I call the 2-year syndrome. My experience was that from 1969, when I left the R.A.A.F, I remained tied mentally to this cycle, although it was now under my own control. As readers will find, the rest of my working life has been a series of work cameos. After leaving NZAIL, I joined Lee's Industries in September 1976 and found Ted Lee's rather like Alf Coleman. Ted built his company up from nothing when he returned from World War II after serving several years in the New Zealand Army, part of which was in the Middle East and Italy. Initially he sold tractors, but by the time I joined them, Lee's was a large group of small factories and diverse in what they manufactured. Factories were located in 2 areas of South Auckland, in Papakura and Pukako. Others were in Tauranga and one in Rangiora, near Christchurch and the South Island. There were also 2 factories in Australia, one in Sydney and one in Melbourne, plus a small factory in Singapore covering sales and servicing of all Lee's products in that area. The factories in Australia were primarily for the assembly and servicing of large container handling forklift trucks. The diverse nature of the group was wide, and the products included marine engines, tractors and tractor-mounted agricultural equipment, all types of forklift trucks, aircraft handling equipment and a number of other manufactured goods. In addition, several agencies were held for products from various overseas countries. Finally, there was a chain of travel agencies. As group sales manager, there was a great deal to learn, but it was different to what I had done before, and I found it both interesting and a challenge. Ted Lee's took advantage of my qualifications as a commercial pilot, and I regularly flew him, his family and company staff, plus overseas visitors around the country. We hired aircraft from Ardmore Airfield aviation companies. Thus, I spent a good deal of time traveling around the country in New Zealand, plus regular visits to Australia. I also served on Ted Lee's team in the NAFTA, New Zealand and Australia Free Trade Agreement, negotiations on tariffs which were held in Sydney and Canberra. One of the interesting sides of the job was looking after overseas visitors. Ted would get me to hire an aircraft to fly them around our New Zealand factories and, whilst doing so, let them enjoy some of the country's tourist spots. Once again, after 2 years, I got itchy feet and also decided to go for a long trip back to UK. Before I did leave, I did 2 longer overseas trips for the company. One was to Bahrain and Dubai, and one to Singapore and Hong Kong to find agencies and to liaise with overseas clients and our own outlets. So my travels continued, and I never tired of that part of my work. During this period, I also continued to do some part-time instructing at the Auckland Aero Club. In 1978, Sean and Valerie learned that they were to go to UK for a 4-year tour on the defence staff at the New Zealand High Commission in London. Since leaving AHACIA, they had spent 3 years at the RNZAF headquarters in Wellington, and we visited them a number of times whilst they were there. However, Valerie did not like Wellington or its cold and windy climate. They were delighted at this plum posting, for Sean had done very well and reached the rank of squadron leader. Furthermore, for this fine work in the introduction of A4 Skyhawk fighters on No. 75 Squadron, he had been awarded an MBE. The posting to Wellington was just a reward, but, of course, it came as a bit of a blow to us, having come specially to New Zealand to be near them. They now had 3 lovely daughters, whose growing up had given much pleasure to us. The blow was softened by our plan to visit UK in 1979. Sean and the girls spent Christmas 1978 with us and then flew out to London at the end of December. Meanwhile, I continued to work at Lee's until we left for UK in early April 1979. We spent 2 days in Singapore on our way to London and also had a week touring Switzerland. Hiring a rental car from Zurich Airport, we stayed one night in the city. It was bitterly cold and a huge contrast in temperatures from leaving New Zealand at the end of summer, plus 2 days in the heat of Singapore. The next morning we headed south to St. Moritz and, thankfully, the weather warmed up and we enjoyed a lovely drive to the famous resort. There was plenty of snow around, but a warm sun enabled us to sit outside at a restaurant and enjoy lunch in St. Moritz. We then drove outside the town and found a delightful chalet hotel at a lovely little village called Sills. In the late afternoon we took a drive and a walk around the village and the nearby lake, where I especially remember a beautiful old St. Bernard dog sitting outside one of the village shops. The next morning we continued our drive down to Locarno on the edge of Lake Maggiore in Italy. The drive from Locarno to Geneva took us through the Simplon tunnel where our car was loaded onto a train. Spending a night en route at Montreux, we finally got to Geneva, where I had last been in June 1955 for the 50th anniversary of powered flight. Geneva was quite cold, but we were booked into a comfortable hotel and took a bus tour of the city the next day. Finally we left by air for London and a reunion with Valerie and family. They were living at a lovely townhouse enclave by the river at Kensington-on-Thames. The day after we arrived we all went to the Anzac Day service at Westminster Abbey, a memorable occasion. Using Valerie's home as a base we toured England and Wales for 6 months in a car I bought for the trip. It was lovely to have time to stay with so many of our relatives and old friends in so many parts of the country. The visit was enhanced by a long hot summer, an unusual experience for the public of Britain. In my trips up to London I was glad to regularly seek refreshment in the R.A.A.F club in Piccadilly. It was a great place to while away a few hours and meet old friends. When you have been in the service almost 30 years, your circle is wide and varied and it is certain you will bump into someone you know, in such a well-appointed club. I usually like to get to Buckingham Palace in time to watch the last part of the changing the guard then walk through Green Park to Piccadilly. By that time, wearing a suit on a hot day, the R.A.A.F club was like an oasis. During my stay on this visit I met up with my older brother whom I hadn't seen for 30 years. It was quite strange at first, but the years seemed to fall away quite easily. Later on we went and stayed with him in Sheffield and met his family for the first time. He was a member of a very old golf club on the outskirts of Sheffield and we played there. One special feature of the club was its very historic clubhouse, an old manor dating back long enough to be recorded in the Domesday Book. Our time in UK also enabled us to have 2 visits to Carnarvon and travel round places where we courted and where the early days of our marriage were spent. I have always loved North Wales and could happily live there, so these return visits were always a time of great joy and nostalgia. Gladys' sister still lived in Carnarvon and her brother lived in the lovely seaside resort of Nevin on the Lane Peninsula. I always leave this area with sadness and a wish to return again soon. Whilst in Carnarvon I often visited the old airfield at Llandough and wander down the roads and around the old camp buildings. In my mind it all comes alive again and I seem to hear voices and the sounds of the past. The airfield was still closed in 1979, but on a later visit in 1983 I was so pleased to see it open again as a civil airport. We left UK in August and returned to New Zealand, again spending a couple of days in Singapore. On arrival in Auckland I could hardly wait to go to the boarding kennels where our 2 little dogs had been staying. The greetings from both was quite ecstatic and it was wonderful to see them again. After settling back home I started to do a bit more part-time flying again, but to rebuild funds after a long trip I needed to work full-time. I began looking around, but this time I decided I needed a new challenge. One advertisement caught my eye, that for the Auckland Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals for the position of director. I put an application and then rather forgot about it, but, to my surprise after a few weeks, out of the blue, I was called for an interview. Peter Wilson, the president, gave me an initial interview and indicated that he favored me over others. The final interview was set up with 2 other councillors, over dinner at which Gladys was present. It was a night we shall never forget, for midway through dinner, the restaurant proprietor came over and told us that an Air New Zealand DC-10 was overdue from a flight to the Antarctic. I was told later that I had got the job, but the evening was overshadowed by the unfolding of the Mount Erebus tragedy. When we got back home, the news came through that the aircraft must be presumed to have crashed, either in Antarctica or in the sea on its return flight. The next day the wreckage was found with all 258 souls on board dead. New Zealand was in shock for months, for one could never meet anyone who had not known one of the passengers, or crew, or even to have been related to them. Amongst the dead was Peter Mulgrew, who had been in Sir John Hunt's team when Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing scaled Mount Everest. Peter and his wife had been our opposite neighbors when we first came to live in Manuawa. I also knew both pilots. A great deal has been written on the Erebus disaster, speculating on what caused this tragedy. There are people, I am sure, still alive who could shed more light on the cause, but they are silent, by choice, or otherwise. One thing I am sure of is that the real cause was known only to those who died in the snow, and the secret will remain buried with them. Subsequently, I took up my post with the SPCA in January 1980, when it was located in an old ramshackle building in New North Road in the center of Auckland. I knew very soon what a challenge I had on my hands. The society had been wreaked by internal wrangles for the past few years, but things were improving as far as that was concerned. There were still some very odd people on the council, who were driven by self-aggrandizement. Then there were others who were well-meaning, but quite ignorant of business matters. There were some whom I called the cake stall complex when it comes to fundraising. Many of these people worked very hard and dedicated themselves to easing the suffering of animals, but they could not understand that they were running $1 million business. We launched our first professionally run fundraising day in my first year, but some SPCA councillors and members could not understand that they had to pay an experienced professional to organize it. If you were to be successful. It was only when we raised a sum of money, like what they had never before dreamed of, that they began to understand that paying a person who knew what to do was worth the money spent. Another feature of my time with the society was that we got through, despite opposition from some councillors who now claim credit. The concept of the animal village at Manger. This has now been in existence since 1981 and is a fine complex doing wonders for Auckland's deprived animals. I found the tragedy of neglect for many thousands of dogs and cats quite heartbreaking. As we used to say in a slogan, an animal is for life, not just for Christmas. I did have some quite dedicated staff, whose love and care of animals was a joy to behold. Personally, one thing I gained was experience through constant exposure to the media. I was on air, on TV, radio, and also reported in the press regularly. Consequently, I found that I improved considerably in my ability to perform in dealing with this side of my work. After 2 years, I decided that I could get on fine with the animals, but a number of the people I had to deal with got me down, so I decided to leave the SPCA and retire for a time. After leaving the SPCA, I once again did part-time flying for the Auckland Aero Club. I was then invited to stand for president of the club, and I was honored to do so. After a year in this post, the club was having difficulty finding a replacement chief flying instructor for Ross Dawson. Ross had stayed in the job, and done it very well, since I left the post in 1970. I agreed to become CFI and resign as president, but this was only meant to be a temporary measure, until a new CFI could be found. At that time, Robin Porter, the deputy CFI, was disinclined to take the post. So I returned to do what I had first done when I came to New Zealand and began working in 1969. I enjoyed being back on full-time flying again, but it was to be only a short period that I was CFI. Gordon Patrick, an ex-KLM captain and wartime pilot, was secretary manager. He was first class at his job and very well respected and liked by both staff and members. Having been secretary manager when I was president, Gordon and I already had a good working relationship. All went well for 6 months before tragedy struck, when Gordon went for a game of squash late one afternoon with one of the pilots. As they drove back to the club, Gordon, who was at the wheel, gave out a cry and collapsed and died instantly from a massive heart attack. Duncan Sharp, the pilot with him, steered the car into the side of the road, then phoned me with the tragic news from the local police station. Everyone was deeply shocked, and I had the enviable task of going with the police to break the news to his wife. Poor woman, she just could not believe it had happened. Later, in consultation with the president, it was agreed that I would take over as secretary manager. Having been president and with more knowledge of the job than anyone at the time, I was able to step in quickly. Robin Porter then agreed to take over as CFI for the rest of the year, and into 1983 I did the secretary manager job and acted as a backup instructor and charter pilot. Gladys and I had already planned to go to UK again in 1983, and by mutual agreement with the president, Ross Dawson offered to stand in as secretary manager for the 4 months I would be overseas. I enjoyed the job and found the mix of administration and flying very agreeable. Of course, I was no chicken, at now 60 years of age, but fit and active, so age was not a problem. Valerie and Sean were nearing the end of their 4-year tour at the New Zealand High Commission in London, so it was a good opportunity to go and stay with them. Once again our poor little dogs were off to the kennels, but we did have an excellent place for them to board, run by 2 genuine animal lovers. So we knew that they would be well cared for in our absence. On this trip we decided to go via Singapore again both ways, but during our stay in UK to go to Denmark. I had a long-standing invitation to go and visit Jørgen Helm, who is now living at Snickerston, 30 miles north of Copenhagen. We went for a week and had a wonderful time. Gladys loved Denmark and especially Copenhagen. We also went on the ferry for a day trip to Malmö in Sweden. Another attraction was Hamlet's castle at Helsingør. One amusing side of the ferry trip to Malmö was to see the old retired people on the ferry. They travel backwards and forwards several times a day, and whilst they are on the boat they can enjoy duty-free drinking and smoking. They can also bring so much duty-free ashore with them, which seemed a very good retirement pastime. Jørgen and his wife Layla treated us magnificently and we had a wonderful trip. The rest of our tour in UK was taken up doing all the usual visits to relatives and friends. Whilst in London, Valerie and Sean broke the news to us that they had decided to stay in England after Sean's 4-year tour at the New Zealand High Commissioner ended. It came as little surprise, as Sean had learned that on his return to New Zealand he would be posted back to Wellington, and they hated the prospect of that move. It was their hope that we would now consider a move back to UK as well. We decided to give this close consideration over the next few months when we returned to New Zealand. During the last few weeks of our visit, Valerie was busy house hunting and they found a nice house not far from where they then lived. They were to move after we had left and would be living in Teddington, not far from Kingston, where they were living at the end of their time in the R.A.A.F. In 1984 Sean resigned from the R.A.A.F. and obtained a job in the aviation industry in London with Lucas Aerospace. A highlight for me was a week in Paris at the air show, when I went as a correspondent for New Zealand Wings, a marvelous way to attend. Unlike 1975, I was able to see all the show thoroughly, both static and air displays, and in the comfort of the press center. As an exhibitor in 1975 I had been too busy to see much of the rest of the displays at all, especially the wonderful static exhibition halls. The show was memorable as well for the appearance, both in static and flying displays, of the American 747 with the space shuttle on its back. It was a wonderful sight to see these 2 aircraft, the shuttle on the 747's back, taking off and landing. A further highlight for me on this visit was to spend 5 days at the British Open Golf Championship at the Royal Birkdale Golf Course in Lancashire. My niece, Errol, who was married to a police inspector, lived in nearby Southport, close to the golf course. We spent a week with her, which was a very good arrangement. The only blemish was on the last day of the Open, whilst moving in the crowd at last hole, I had my wallet stolen by a pickpocket. Events like this are a prime target, it appears, for professional pickpocket gangs to operate. On our return to New Zealand in August we gave a lot of thought to a move back to UK. After a careful assessment of the situation we found that it would be financially impossible to equate our standard of living in New Zealand to what we could expect in UK. The huge difference in the cost of housing alone, between the two countries, was a stumbling block in itself. For what we could have sold our home for in Auckland, we could have bought a hovel in UK. The cost of living, apart from housing, was also much more expensive as well. So we shelved the idea, at least for the time being. I returned to the Aero Club and took up my flying and administration job as secretary manager again. It was good to be home and have the dogs with us again. Regrettably, they were not to be with us much longer, for they were both getting quite old. Cindy, the poodle, went first from the effects of old age when she was 15. I was heartbroken when I had to have her put to sleep after it became too distressing to see her continued suffering. Jojo was to go a year later in the same way and at the same age. For a few months we just had Tomo's, our ginger marmalade cat. We missed our dogs, and a few months after Jojo went, we got a lovely Terrier ex-pup from the SPCA. Trixie is now 7 and has been a lovely companion over those years. Tomo's also died not long after we got Trixie. I carried on as secretary manager to the Aero Club until July 1984, when I retired completely from full-time work. I did keep up my flying for a few more years, but only in private capacity. My association with aviation continued in various ways. For over the past few years I had been asked to organize the flying displays for a number of major air shows in New Zealand. These had included 2 in Hamilton, 3 in Auckland, 1 in Christchurch and 1 in Palmerston North. All these shows have drawn in huge crowds in excess of 30,000 people. Although, I saved myself, I was considered, at the time, to be the best flying display organizer in the country. Latterly, I have turned to commentating at the shows, and the biggest I have done in this capacity was at the 50th anniversary of the R.A.F display at R.A.F Winnipeg. The crowd at this show was over 130,000. I felt very honored to have been invited to head the commentary team at such a prestigious event. Bill Mudgway, a well-known figure on radio in Auckland, and as an eye-in-the-sky broadcaster, has been a good friend and co-commentator at several of these shows. Bill has a superb manner on air and is totally professional in his approach. My last show in 1992 was to be part of Bill's team at Air Expo at Auckland Airport. My further interest in aviation had been with a chap who has become a close friend. The Commuter Airlines Association, on which I served, had a check-in counter at Auckland Airport to serve its members. Our manager was Bob Shepard, one of the nicest persons I have ever met, and one of the most efficient and reliable. Bob has a long association with the airport, with Pan Am Airlines and also running the airport security service. Later on, Bob and I set up in partnership and ran the commuter counter service as a business. Unfortunately, a number of smaller carriers, who used the counter, merged with the bigger airlines. This meant a reduction in carriers using the commuter counter down to a level that was unsustainable as a business. We closed the operation down after 2 years. Bob had managed the counter and I had run the accounts and administration. We still keep the partnership alive, in case an opportunity comes to start up again. In 1986, Gladys and I took another trip to UK, but it was hampered by disability that she had suffered after a bad fall in February that year. As a result of a fall down stone steps, she broke her thigh and had to have it pinned. She spent several weeks in hospital, but, by sheer determination, got mobile enough to travel in June. However, it was necessary for her to have a wheelchair at the various airports. This time we went to UK via Honolulu and Canada. Firstly, we spent 2 nights in Hawaii and then flew to Vancouver. After a night in a hotel there, we hired a rental car and drove through British Columbia and the Rockies, taking 3 days for the drive to reach our destination of Calgary. It was my first visit to the city since I trained there in 1941, a spell of 45 years. Calgary has grown into a huge oil center and was quite unrecognizable from when I was there as a young 18-year-old airman. From Calgary we flew on to Amsterdam, where we spent a night, but this lovely old city has become spoiled by pollution and drugs and we were not very impressed with the scruffy appearance. The next day we flew to London Airport and were met by Valerie, Sean and our 3 lovely granddaughters. Gladys had coped very well with the journey, despite her disability. Once again I bought a car for the 4-month stay and we did all the usual trips to visit relatives and friends. The highlight of the visit for me was to again be a correspondent for New Zealand Wings, to cover the 1986 Farnborough Air Show. Sean was also on duty there with the Lucas Aerospace stand. The weather was good and I had a great week, as usual, meeting up with a number of old R.A.A.F chums. The highlights of the show were the visit of the huge Antonov 124, the largest cargo aircraft in the world, and the appearance of the two next-generation fighters. A European consortium had its era and the French the Rafale. They performed against one another in spectacular fashion, but the real showstopper was a superb display each day of the famous Royal Air Force Red Arrows. Their display made me feel so proud of the service I had been with for so long. Before leaving London, I went to Blackbush Airport and flew the R.A.F. aircraft, a revolutionary designed small trainer, powered by an automobile engine. The prime mover in this venture was Richard Noble, the then holder of the world land speed record, whom I found a delightful and modest personality. Soon after Farnborough we left for Auckland once again via Vancouver and Hawaii. Whilst we had been in UK, some old New Zealand friends of ours, Hans and Jocelyn Schilling, had moved into an apartment in Vancouver. They had invited us to stay for a week and we were really looking forward to this, after our previous night stop. I had always wanted to see this fine city, since I had been in Canada in 1941. People in Calgary at that time had told me that I must see Vancouver. Unfortunately, in 1942 when I left Canada there had not been time. I have been as far as Banff in the Rockies, but that gap between there and Vancouver had always eluded me. The Schillings are a lovely couple and had been our opposite neighbors in Manuawa. He had been in the African Corps in the desert in 1942, where he had been taken prisoner by the British. After the war he emigrated from his home in Breslau in East Germany to Canada. He had later married Jocelyn, who was a New Zealander, and they had come to live in Auckland. Tragically, their only daughter Lisa, age 13, had been killed in Manuawa by a drunken driver. They had never been settled in New Zealand after that and had moved to Vancouver. Lisa, a lovely-natured and beautiful girl, had been struck down with so much life before her, a terrible tragedy. We had a fabulous week with them and they took us to so many lovely spots in and around the city. Their apartment was by the beautiful Queen Elizabeth Park and I walked around the spacious area and enjoyed its loveliness, around and along the shoreline each day. The weather was beautiful all week, which was lucky, as it was fall, autumn, and the winter was not far away. After this happy time we left for Honolulu, where we spent a couple of nights before returning to Auckland. I always enjoy my swims off Waikiki Beach whenever I go to Hawaii. This was, sadly, to be our last trip overseas together, for Gladys suffered terrible setbacks to her health. Over the past 3 years she has had cancer surgery, also major surgery to her leg due to circulation problems, and is now confined to a wheelchair, and I am her nurse. Apart from a trip to Sydney for the Bicentennial Air Show, 3 years ago, when she was well enough for me to go, I have not been away for more than one night at the time. Gladys has shown considerable courage and fortitude in constant health adversity throughout this period. We did have a short visit from Valerie in 1992 when she came with her cousin Errol, especially to see her mother. Sally, our eldest granddaughter, also came 3 years ago and stayed 4 months after she graduated with honours from London University. She has grown into a very beautiful young woman and it was a great joy to have her with us. We do miss not being able to visit our friends and relatives in UK anymore, especially Valerie and Sean and our 3 granddaughters. My brother is 77 and my 2 sisters, Violet age 80 and Nora age 79, are all still going along well. Thankfully, at 71 I too am in good health, a godsend, with Gladys needing constant care and attention. We celebrated our golden wedding in April and had a small party of friends to share it with us. I gave up flying 2 years ago after 50 years, which is not a bad innings I suppose, but I continued my interest in aviation and in many other activities. My present appointments are Vice Patron of the Auckland Aero Club and Flight Safety Advisor, member of the Auckland Airport Operators Committee, and President of the Auckland Officers Club and President of the Auckland Brevet Club. These responsibilities keep me very busy, apart from running the home. I love my golf and play 3 times a week at the nearby beautiful Manukau Golf Club. My little dog Trixie is a constant and devoted companion. Fortunately, we still have a wide circle of good and loyal friends, so we make the most of our circumstances. Both Gladys and I had, as readers will have read, enjoyed very full lives, but the future for us now remains clouded. I still nurse hopes of traveling again and especially to visit, or return to live in UK, who knows? Meanwhile, I reflect on life. I have seen great changes. In my aviation profession alone, I have seen it go from old-fashioned biplanes to men landing on the moon, something I never thought I would see. Communications have been revolutionized from the crystal radio set to colored TV, bringing instantly to your living room world events and sports as they occur. As a child, the streets of London were full of horses and carts along with the earlier cars. Now the motor car is everywhere, dominating cities. The First World War had only ended 4 years before I was born, when its aftermath was still clearly evident. The Second World War shaped my life in every way, but the world is still in turmoil and there is little evidence of it getting much better. Man's lust for power and greed will ensure that continued strife, I regret to say. However, life has been good to me and I don't complain, but I just keep optimistic and enjoy every day as best I can. Postscript: very sadly, my darling Gladys passed away on 27th of November, 1993, as I complete this story. She had borne many illnesses with true Welsh grit. Shortly I will travel to Wales to carry out her wish for her ashes to be scattered on Mount Snowdon, near Carnarvon, where we met and have enjoyed so much love and happiness together. Now I must face the future without her undivided love, support and loyalty.